you like sci-fi, fantasy, action, adventure, and comic books, then you've come to the right place for your weekly dose of anything and everything geek. So strap in and let's get this show on the road. Welcome to the Science Fictionary podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Science Fictionary podcast, the podcast brought to you by the ScienceFictionary.com, where we discuss all things in the world of sci-fi, fantasy, and superheroes and action adventure in the world of pop culture. I am Daniel, and joining me are Marisha.
Hey, everybody.
And Andrew.
What's going on?
And David.
Hello.
All right, and this is going to be this week's Pillar of Sci-Fi episodes. This is actually our last Pillars of Sci-Fi episode. This is our miscellaneous category. Anything we had we didn't feel fell solely in the realm of novels or television or movies. So this was kind of a hard one because you can sort of pull from anything you left out of the other categories, or like I said, bring something in that doesn't completely fit in those categories. And actually, my list is literature. A lot of it's literature, but not really a novel. So I knew I had the novels I wanted, so I decided I needed something for miscellaneous. That's why I left what I left for miscellaneous. That's why I have the list I have now. I'm not sure everybody else kind of went about compiling this. I think this was probably a hard one to come up with, huh?
So, yeah, it was a lot different than compiling one where you have more strict parameters for what you're looking for.
There are no parameters.
Right, there are no parameters, which it means I've got a couple of things that didn't quite work into any of those other categories. I've also got a couple of things that are more or less things that were created by accomplishments of specific people.
Yeah, the way I interpret it, mine kind of, when looking at my list, the best way I can explain mine and the way I interpret it is basically my 4 items kind of ended up just being what, if there were 4 more pillars of sci-fi, what would they be?
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Interesting. But actually, I think I'm going to start because one that I almost included when I said I expanded the novels category to be literature also, this was something I wanted to include. But again, I knew I had to do this category. So I've waited a long time to mention this, but Action Comics #1. It is the beginning. Yeah, it is the beginning of the superhero genre. Of course, the first appearance of Superman, and
which the concept of Superman's. Sorry, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, this really is the first superhero. I mean, it really was. It was the first time we saw a character with these otherworldly powers. And of course, when you look at the sci-fi we have today, when you look at how much the MCU has just taken over entertainment, this is where it begins. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created this character, and it's really, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but there's really, really interesting history and backstory to how Superman was created, how the publishing came about. They basically gave him to national publications, to what later became DC Comics, which led later in their lives to a huge legal battle. It's a very interesting story, but just the importance of Action Comics #1, I don't think can be overstated to what we see in entertainment now. That's where it all began. Superman is still, I think somebody did a poll, the most recognized symbols in the world are the Christian cross, Mickey Mouse ears, and the Superman S, right? So Action Comics #1 is the first thing on my miscellaneous list.
Okay.
Yeah, the very concept of Superman is very sci-fi itself. It's an alien whose powers are based on, like, these scientific things coming from space. So yeah, I like it.
Yeah, that's a great choice.
So who else has their first one? Marisha?
All right. So mine are just random. Just to give you a heads up for my different categories. I went lots of different directions, but one of the things I was kind of looking at is one of the big inspirations, obviously one of the biggest inspirations for sci-fi has been literature, right? Different literature over the years. But the interesting thing is kind of the back and forth with the literature and the science and the art, and just sort of how they have kind of, it is a chicken or the egg kind of question as far as, what inspired what. But I think that you could make a really good argument that a lot of the interest in kind of futuristic technologies, that one of the earliest visual examples of that is the scientific drawings of Da Vinci. I mean, he wasn't writing stories about
Ooh, I hadn't
flying,
thought of that.
but he was drawing flying machines and underwater breathing apparatus and tanks. The sort of things that sci-fi loves to deal with is what things can people do that people aren't meant to do. And, the quintessential Renaissance man drew them and designed them, and they've actually built some of them and they work. And he has his inventions and his artwork and his explanations for all of these things. I mean, he just theorized things that they couldn't prove would actually work for the next 500 years. But people still talked about it, and they drew pictures inspired by it, and they told stories inspired by it. So that's my first pillar of sci-fi, is the scientific and engineering theorizing of Da Vinci.
And I
That's
like
awesome.
that one. I like that one. I didn't think of it. And I like that one because at the time, he was designing things he thought could be used in the real world. And since that time, his designs have really influenced a lot of science fiction, a lot of designs that are used in science fiction,
Yep.
which I think is, yeah, I like that one. I can see that. I
Yeah.
understand why you picked it.
I like this a lot better than my first choice.
And for anybody who's wondering, I thought about this a minute ago, for anybody who's wondering, the reason I go to Marisha first so often is because if I'm looking from left to right on my screen, Marisha's the first person I see.
That
In
works.
case anybody was wondering. But Andrew, what do you have first on your list?
Okay, so I went deep down the rabbit hole of proto science fiction. Things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Ramayana from India, which is the stories of Rama and the avatars of Vishnu, and things. Gilgamesh isn't truly sci-fi; it's more fantasy, but it does start getting into human reason and the quest for immortality. The Ramayana, flying machines that could go to other planets and had weapons that could destroy cities. There was a writer, a Greek writer, around 400 BC, wrote a couple of plays, The Clouds and the Birds, and a couple of others, where it was based on the trope of the fantastic voyage, traveling to other planets. But what I finally arrived at is what I believe, and what a lot of other people believe, to be the first true example of science fiction, written in about the year 160, sometime in the mid second century, by Lucian, an Assyrian writer, who wrote a satire called True History. And
Spoiler alert, not true history.
and in this book, he explored voyages to outer space, conversations with alien life forms, interplanetary warfare, creatures created by human technology, worlds working by alternate physics. All those explored in this book.
In the year what?
In the second century, like around
In the
160.
second century, this dude was writing Star Trek.
Pretty much.
That's crazy.
And so True History is my first entry. I didn't want to do a lot of proto science fiction because a lot of it's not true science fiction, but this has way too many of the tropes we still use to not consider it science fiction.
That's great. I didn't know about that.
I didn't either. That's actually pretty interesting. So, David, what do you have on your list then?
Pretty similar to Marisha. I actually looked to the real world And so the actual entry on my list is the real world. When we're doing this Pillars of Science Fiction, a big theme is what inspires things. And something we haven't talked about enough is how it all begins with what is actually being invented every day in the real world.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have guys like Elon Musk who are inventing things that he has seen in science fiction and wants to bring to the real world, like, freaking amazing flamethrowers and creating a company called SpaceX and building rocket ships and stuff. But then you also have guys that like Da Vinci, like you said, that designed things and built things that then later inspired everything we know about science fiction. We were talking earlier about like atom punk and things like that, about how Star Trek, all of Star Trek's technology from the original series was based off of what actual people in real life invented and what the technology looked like for that time. Humans.
Wait, I'm confused.
What? I'm sorry. What?
Is your entry onto this list basically everything?
No, it's just real life technology.
So,
yeah.
it's real interesting when you
Okay, I
actually
got you.
when you actually step back and look, because kind of in my digging, I started looking at the parallels of the development of computers with the way science fiction advanced, and there's some pretty close parallels there. And also with flight. As soon as people actually achieved flight, science fiction changed. So yes,
Yep.
that's the interesting thing
Yeah, that's what
about
I'm getting
science
at.
fiction, is that science fiction inspires creators. Creators create real things, which inspires more science fiction. And
Yeah.
it was pretty interesting to see what technological advancements mirrored and changed science fiction writing.
Right, and that's kind of, and thank you for better explaining that than I guess I was, because that's kind of what I was getting at, was when you think about what influences science fiction, we've yet to mention the real life computers that people invented, like and flight and the atomic bomb that was invented, and without these actual real life inventions and these technological advances, like you look at Star Trek from the original series, and it all looks that way because that's what computers look like then. But then you look at the 2009 Star Trek, and it all looks that way because we had touchscreen phones and Apple.
Okay.
Does
Yeah.
that make sense? What I'm getting at?
Yes. Yeah. No. Yeah. I got what you're saying.
Yeah.
And like I said, like the way I interpreted miscellaneous was just like basically creating like if there were just more pillars of what inspires sci-fi. So real life technology.
Yeah, and theorizing about like, okay, we know this about technology, so now let's talk then Einstein and the theory of relativity, and then that spawns its own new thing. So yeah, the inventions and the speculations of smart people, then creative people get to sit around and write about them. It's a pretty cool back and forth.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Is that everybody for round one?
Yep.
All right,
It's your turn again.
it's my turn
Well,
again.
you went first.
Yeah, you went
Well,
first.
it's my turn. Okay. Well, then the next thing on my list, and we kind of touched as again something we touched on a little bit in another pillar. Mine is basically the artwork of Jack Kirby. The David mentioned the Marvel cosmic universe in a previous episode. I guess in our literature episode, and the artwork of Jack Kirby plays right into that. From the time when he introduced Galactus and the Silver Surfer in Fantastic Four, his artwork that took place in the cosmic universe and in Marvel, and then more so actually when he got to DC Comics and created the New Gods, have really inspired and been a basis for the way a lot of technology and beings in science fiction are actually viewed. I find myself a lot of times, and maybe it's just because I am such a comic book fan in the first place, and I've seen these images so much. Those are the pictures that pop in my head when I visualize a lot of sci-fi that I'm reading. is things like that, but it's actually influenced the production design on a lot of films and television shows. I just think it was a big influence on the way sci-fi technology is visualized. So Jack Kirby's artwork makes my list.
Nice.
Awesome.
I was actually thinking that for mine. So yeah, that's a good choice.
So now it's Marisha's turn.
Now it's Marisha's turn. Okay, so my second the second thing on my list is the Orson Welles radio broadcast of the War of the Worlds in 1938. It was so convincing. People were literally losing their minds because they really, honest to God, thought that they were being invaded from outer space. With special effects created by blenders and vacuum cleaners in a studio somewhere. I mean, it's and this was kind of the same criteria that I had for movies. It's like if I was going to give it its own entry separate from literature, it had to be a distinct thing and have a distinct impression, right? And I think that radio broadcast was an important moment for people in the way that they, science fiction was something that had, been lots of in pulp magazines and comic strips and things. But this one, man, this was in their home. And anyway, it was just such an iconic and memorable thing. I mean, it's something that, almost, 80 years later now? Over 80 years later, almost 90 years later, we're still talking about this. And that's really significant for a medium that we don't even use hardly anymore. I mean, radio broadcasts like that are not something we do. Radio just for entertainment, not for music, not for talk shows, but that's not even something we do anymore. But that's still something that's such a part of our cultural experience that it's something we still talk about.
Okay, so my next entry on the list, let's see which one to do next. I'm going to put this one in next. No, I'm not. So my next entry is Flash Gordon. It didn't quite fit. It started off as a comic strip. It eventually became film serials. So it really never fit in any of the exact categories that we laid out.
Because at one time or another, it kind of placed itself in all of them, right?
Right.
Right.
But I mean, it's earliest. The things that were most influential were the comic strips and the film serials, which are just short serials before the main feature. And so it wasn't TV, it wasn't a movie, even though eventually they did combine some of the serials to create a feature-length movie. It was still just the serials that were just all cut together. So I included it here. It's got an interesting history. We know that George Lucas ultimately created Star Wars, at least when he did, because he wanted to make a Flash Gordon movie, and he couldn't get the rights. Interesting thing as I kind of researched this was realizing that King Features Syndicate that created Flash Gordon initially wanted to create a film strip of John Carter of Mars, but couldn't come to an agreement with Burroughs for the rights.
Right.
And so, kind of this history, but it's one of the first big space operas. It influenced all science fiction that came after, all science-based science fiction that came after. It across, film strips, comic books, TV, movies. There was even a 26-episode radio drama. And it was one of the first things, along with Buck Rogers, where there was tons of merchandise that went along with it. And I think just because of it being so early and the influence it had later on, especially things like Star Wars, which was on my movies list, Flash Gordon is my next entry.
Okay. And
Awesome.
I like that one. That's actually that's a really good one. Flash Gordon, from the time it started, as you said, it has since inspired nearly every major sci-fi creation since. So that
Mhm.
one definitely, that might be the best one so far. But David, what do you have next?
Next up, and we've touched on it ever so slightly bit, uh, but my next entry are science fiction video games as a pillar of sci-fi, and specifically, if I had to pick just a couple that I think are probably the biggest, most influential, and important ones that represent sci-fi, I would say the Fallout series, Mass Effect, and Halo as probably the biggest and best science fiction video games. And that's a medium that I think that in the future will probably become so big and so important just on its own that it really does become its own category of pillar of sci-fi. Because video games are going to introduce a lot of have introduced a lot of people to sci-fi. It's a brand new experience for fans of sci-fi to be able to interact with these concepts and themes and worlds that they love so much. And I think it's an important piece of being a science fiction fan in many ways is getting to experience it all through a video game where you get to play it firsthand yourself. The Star Trek games, Star Wars games, they all get represented there and provide that opportunity.
Yeah, I think
And
you're
they're
right.
freaking dope.
Yeah, I think going forward, I think that sci-fi video games will continue to have an increasing effect on the next generation of sci-fi fans.
Hmm.
I mean, because even people, Andrew and your dad's age, they were playing video games when they were kids and teenagers, and I
Space
mean,
Invaders.
yeah, exactly right, Space Invaders, yeah, and how much that's just become increasingly true every decade that video games become more and more of the young adult and childhood experience, and so I think that you're right.
Mhm.
I think that going forward that we're going to start to see a lot of things like in the same way that we see a lot of real world things that are very influenced by Star Trek and Star Wars. I think going forward, we're going to start seeing a lot more things that are influenced by.
So I bounced around a couple of other ideas for this. And to tell you all the truth, basically like all of your entries better than anything else I thought of so far. So,
But you should still give us what you got.
but I don't really. This is what I'm telling you. And I know I stick right there in that world of comic books too much because the next thing on my list would have been Valerian and Laureline. But I don't know. I don't want to be too much into comic books, like fill my whole miscellaneous with it. I feel like my first two entries had much more influence on the rest of science fiction, maybe than that did.
Yeah, I'm thinking outside the box here for these.
Yeah.
There's another artist I almost put in there, but I already mentioned Jack Kirby. I don't know that I feel right to have another comic book artist in there with him, and then you're kind of like splitting hairs. So I chose Kirby.
Yeah. See,
You know where I'm going with it?
I have an artist on mine, but he's probably falling at fifth on my list of four.
Marisha, what do you have next?
The next thing I have is The Planets by Holst because
I was expecting that one.
yeah, I think that was my when I had to pick one. I think that was the one that I pulled out because just the sort of ethereal feel. It was evoking that outer space kind of feel in music was and it obviously influenced a lot of really important music and sci-fi going forward. The Mars, the rhythm bum 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 is been really influential in things like the Imperial March, right? Bum 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 bum. It's got that same sort of feel, and it's got a lot of things that we sort of associate with outer space, like the kind of like tinkling harp, the little kind of sounds going on, and the way that he uses percussion, to kind of evoke that kind of far away and ethereal sort of ambiance is something that's been used over and over again in sci-fi. So I don't know that Holst was the first person to really do it, but he definitely has done it most famously and had some really direct influence on really important music and sci-fi going forward. So he's my
Okay.
number 3 choice.
Yeah.
All right. And Andrew, do you have a third one?
I do. This one's a little different. This one is going to be it's a magazine, a long-running magazine. It's Amazing Stories. Started in 1926 by Hugo Gernsback. And you may not know the last name, but you definitely know the first name if you're a science fiction fan, because the Hugo Awards are named for Hugo Gernsback.
Wow.
So this magazine, along with he also started the Science Fiction League. Really, this was the beginning of science fiction fandom. I mean, we're talking about the man who coined the term science fiction.
Right.
Well, that's
And-
where Buck Rogers was first published.
right. And so
It's
he's
in Amazing Stories.
right. And he started this magazine, and when people would write letters to the magazine, he published addresses of when the letters came in. You couldn't do that now, but in 1926 you could.
Yeah.
And what that led to was these groups beginning, people would get those addresses and start writing with people, and it really is the beginning of science fiction fandom, because these groups begin to reach out to each other and organize. And all of that through this magazine. And it's all that for, Gernsback was apparently not a real good guy. He would refuse to pay his artists and stuff like that. But the magazine he created, it is the root of science fiction fandom.
I like that. I'm liking this list so far. I think we're coming up with some good entries here. David, what do you have next?
That is a great choice because I didn't know any of that. So my next entry is actually, I just have fandom, the science fiction community in general as a pillar of sci-fi.
Yeah.
That is the one thing that if you take away from any of these pillars, science fiction no longer exists. It no longer is viable. We don't get any more of it. It's done. The one thing that you need is the fandom, the conventions. See, this actually started with, I was going to put cosplay because I didn't know what else to put here. So I was going to put science fiction cosplay, but then that made me start thinking about conventions and stuff like that. And then it just led to overall fandom. So it's sort of like you got really specific, and as mine haven't been very specific. So you got really specific with this magazine that kind of started fandom. My entry was just fandom in general as a pillar of sci-fi. What we do here,
Right.
podcasts,
Right.
fan films, conventions, just people having conversations about it, being a fan and paying for the tickets to see the movies and tuning in on TV and buying the books, talking about it. That's what keeps it all alive. That's what keeps it all going. None of it exists without fandom.
That's very true.
Yep.
Okay. Marisha, we're back around to you again.
We're back around to me. Okay, so I had a couple of things that I kind of threw around, but at risk of being too similar to now 2 of Andrew's entries, I think Buck Rogers has to make this list, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, because you don't
Buck Rogers
ultimately
would have been on mine too.
ultimately you don't.
well,
get
why don't you
Flash
tell us
Gordon.
about Buck Rogers then, Daniel? Because I don't really have that much to
Oh,
say
no.
about it, except for I just, what I read about it on.
Well,
Okay, so Flash
I
Gordon.
didn't get prepared either. I'm just telling you, Buck Rogers crossed my
Okay.
mind, and especially then when Andrew mentioned Flash Gordon, I went,
Yeah.
well, that's really
Buck Rogers was first. Flash Gordon was actually created to compete head to head with Buck Rogers.
Yeah, Buck
And
Rogers
see, I didn't know that.
was first published in this adventure magazine that he's been talking about in 1926 was the first, and then they decided to adapt it into a comic strip, and so it kind of spiraled from there into film shorts and eventually a movie in the 70s and comic books and just all kinds of different things, different mediums. But Yeah, Buck Rogers was definitely one that it was kind of. I was looking. I always assumed that space opera was like some sort of like highfalutin kind of thing. You know, it was like it's an opera but in space. No, it's like soap operas but space.
Right.
I was like, oh, that's funny. That's not
And-
nearly the idea I had in my head for what a space opera was. But yeah, it was
And they started as comic strips.
right. Then spawned the comic strip and the radio show.
Right. It all kind of spawned from there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to tell you the truth. I did not realize. I knew Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers were really close, but I didn't know which one came first. And
Buck Rogers-
And Buck Rogers did. Andrew's right.
Yeah, and it had a lot of influence on Flash Gordon, as well as when their film serials, they both used a crawl in the opening.
Oh, that's really interesting. I had no idea. I missed that detail
Nice.
totally. You know, and as far as that, you know, is if I'm taking a page out of David's book and just going with kind of really general topics, I mean, the radio show, y'all. I mean, how different would all of science fiction be if it weren't for Superman radio show and Buck Rogers radio shows and all these radio shows, people who were too poor to have a television and who were probably too poor to go to the movies, but they had a radio and they'd sit around in their houses and listen to these serials.
Right.
You know, that's an important part of the science fiction experience there. So anyway, that's
true.
my next selection is Buck Rogers.
Okay, my next
I like
one.
that. I agree with that one. That
Yeah,
definitely was would have been on my list as well if I'd gotten that far.
yeah. Buck Rogers definitely needed to be on the list.
Absolutely. What'd you have next then, Andrew?
Okay, so the next one is a little bit different than it's in that it is not a single specific thing, but more the works of an individual. And I actually talked about this on our last episode. The sound design of Ben Burt. Like I said before, you know, we're talking about a man that changed the way science fiction sounded. When George Lucas turned him loose. Now, it wasn't that he hadn't done stuff before, but when George Lucas hired him, George Lucas just turned him loose, gave him some general ideas of things he needed sounds for, and turned him loose. And he has, I mean, when you look at the things that he's done, I mean, he did Invasion of the Body Snatchers, E.T., Wall-E. He did that 2009 Star Trek movie. And so I think because he really shaped the way sound design is approached for science fiction now, that his overall body of works should be included on this list. And I did want to mention, as another sound designer, Doug Grinstaff deserves to be at least an honorable mention on this list. He worked on the original Star Trek series. And Star Trek, the original series, is one of the few shows, even today, that you can be in another room and you don't have to hear dialogue or music, but you can tell what you're listening to because of the sound, because of the backdrop created by the sound design.
Yep, absolutely. The beeps and the warbles and the the whistle when the captain comes on deck.
All right. No, that one definitely deserves to be there too. I haven't heard anything yet that I disagree with too strongly.
Yeah.
So
Really? I thought you would disagree with everything I said.
well, as a general principle, I do, but you're doing okay tonight. I get your point. No, not really.
All right, so
what
David,
do you have next then, David? Let's see if I disagree with it or not.
I actually, just like Marisha and now Andrea picked something in the realm of sound. I picked, and I wanted to say just in general, the music and sounds of sci-fi, but that one's even more general than my other ones, and I thought that was too much. So I had to pick one. I decided to go with the works of John Williams.
Yep.
That's an obvious choice for sure, and I know that he was inspired by things like like the planets. But when you think of what is the most
Mm-hmm.
iconic sounds in sci-fi,
Yep.
it's John Williams'
It's all him.
Star Wars.
Yep.
All of the music, it adds so much to
And Superman.
what Star Wars
Yep.
was.
Yep.
Yeah, and then Jurassic Park, right?
Yes.
Right.
So much more. Like there are so many movies that I watch and I'm like, that sounds really good. I bet John Williams did that just because it sounds that good. And then I look it up, and of course, it was John Williams who did it.
And if it's
so I
in-
know he
yeah.
wasn't. What?
Yeah, no, it's very true.
Yeah. So like, and I know that he was inspired by previous works, but I mean, when I think science fiction, truly one of the very first things that hits my head is sound and music. And I love music. I love the use of music in films. It's very important to me in my experience, and I'm sure most people's experiences. And John Williams is the king of that. I also love the music of Star Trek.
Yeah.
Just to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, then there's a lot of music in there. I mean, you can even talk about Danny Elfman.
Danny Elfman is a king.
Right.
I love
but
Danny
John
Elfman.
Williams is the greatest composer
Of his generation.
in the last century.
Yeah.
And so even though he was inspired by people like Holst, John Williams changed the scape of not just of what sci-fi movies, but movies, period. He changed what a soundtrack, what a score for a movie could be. And absolutely deserves to be on this list.
Yeah.
And Marisha and I both only don't have him on our list because we were pretty sure you did.
Yeah.
He's just the way that he makes sci-fi music operatic is just brilliant. It's like, so much sci-fi music historically had been so weird, and here he was like, oh no, I'm going to do Wagner. I'm doing straight up Wagner in a sci-fi movie. Who does that? And of course now everybody wants to do straight up Wagner in a sci-fi movie because he did it so good.
Well, he's probably inspired more people to play classical music or to become composers themselves in at least 100 years.
Yep.
Also, it'd be a shame if we didn't mention the most important science fiction song of all time, the Star Trek Enterprise theme, Faith of the Heart.
Oh gosh.
I think that one's a killer all by itself.
No, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, and we're going to go move back around to Marisha again.
Well, I think we've all done all four. We've done our 4 entries, I believe.
Yeah.
Yep. Everybody's done? Okay. Good deal.
So we're ending on Faith of the Heart.
No, that is not going on the list.
I'm just kidding.
Okay. All right. So anyway, I like our list, though.
No, it's
Buck
good.
Rogers, Flash Gordon, the works of Jack Kirby, Action Comics #1. I know I'm leaving some out. I'm not going to name them all right now, but I think we came up with a really good list.
A really interesting and diverse list, I think.
Right, which is what it was supposed to be. It's a miscellaneous category. So that is our Pillars of Sci-Fi in the miscellaneous category. And that will complete our Pillars of Sci-Fi series. So until next time, Marisha, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me at princessesandpadawans.com. I am on Instagram. I have an Instagram account. I am not on Instagram currently, actually, putting stuff up. But you can go see old stuff at princesses_and_padawans. And occasionally, whenever Twitter isn't too depressing, I'm on there. And I am Padawans on Twitter.
All right, and Andrew?
And you can find me running the Twitter account for this show at Sci_Fictionary. You can find me hosting our other show every Tuesday, Coruscant Radio Underground, where we cover all things Star Wars. You can find me at thesciencefictionary.com. You can drop us a line at thesciencefictionary@gmail.com, and you can check me out on my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/darklighter580. And as always, be sure to check us out as well as all of the rest of our podcast family at red5network.com.
All right, and David?
You guys can find me on Twitter at stay_creativedb and on my YouTube channel, Creative D&D. And always remember to have faith of the heart.
Oh, good grief. And I am Dan C. Peeps on Twitter, and we'll see you next time.